All right. Thanks. Good to be here for a second day. And today I'm going to be taking the first half hour or so, maybe 45 minutes, and finishing up what we were doing yesterday, and then turn to something completely different, which is the one of the two papers that I had thought about presenting for the second lecture, and that's on climate agreements. But right now we're kind of continuing on with trade agreements and the GATT WTO. And what we did yesterday was basically go through, hopefully establish the idea that, starting from the view that the design of a trade agreement should reflect its purpose or the problem that it's supposed to solve. If we strip the world of the 21st century challenges, the purpose of a trade agreement is to help governments escape from a terms of trade dilemma. That's certainly what the most of the literature and economics suggests would be the purpose. And what I've argued is the fundamental design features of GATT are well equipped to serve that purpose. And I've also tried to convince you that the harmony between purpose and design of GATT can help account for the success in terms of bargaining tariffs down to a low level that GATT and the WTO achieved in the 20th century. So now we take the second step of this lecture, which is the purpose of a trade agreement different in the 21st century? If so, then the fundamental challenges to the design of the world trading system may be, fundamental changes may be needed to the design of the world trading system, and if not, then not fundamental changes, and the current structure of GATT WTO just needs to be focused on these new challenges and addressing them. And so what I want to consider for the next half hour or so, 40 minutes, is these five challenges that I mentioned. The first being the rise of large emerging markets led by China. The second being how the WTO can accommodate efforts to address climate change. The third being whether the WTO needs to alter its fundamental design in the presence of digital trade. The fourth being the rise of offshoring and global value chains, and whether that is changing in a fundamental way the purpose of a trade agreement, and therefore requires changes in the WTO fundamentally. And then finally, the push for regulatory harmonization, which I may or may not get to and emphasize. Okay, so let's start with the rise of large emerging markets led by China. And here I would say that there are really three interrelated challenges. The first one is fundamentally about China, and it's essentially the non-reciprocity that has emerged between China and its large trading partners as a result of China's 2001 accession negotiation to the WTO. And the one way to think about this is, well, China is a non-market economy that is likely to stay that way for quite some time. And Mark Wu famously coined the phrase China Inc., which is a kind of a catch-all for the special ways that China combines market and non-market forces to achieve its goals within the Chinese system. And so that raises the question, does China Inc. or does a non-market system for a country raise the purpose of a trade agreement when that country joins the trade agreement? And that's a really fundamental question that I think the world is facing, because there's a lot of view currently, a widely held view, that the answer to that is probably yes, that the WTO and GATT before it is just not well set out to handle a non-market economy in terms of its membership and its obligations to the WTO, because the GATT and the WTO is all about tariff commitments, and those tariff commitments are supposed to imply market access commitments that have price impacts through markets. And for a non-market economy like China, tariff commitments really don't do what they would for a market economy. And so that raises the question, well, if China is really going to stick with its system, perhaps the only way forward is to decouple from China. And there's certainly a view of that out there in the world, that is what is needed. And what I want to argue here is that, at least according to the terms of trade theory, you can take a strong view against that. That I don't think that is really the way to think about accommodating China, because ultimately the purpose of the trade agreement, even if China is a non-market economy, doesn't change. And the way to think about that at a formal level is, suppose that we solved suppose we had a two-country world, and we solved the non-cooperative policy choices for the two governments first, and then we solved the cooperative policy choices. And the way that the terms of trade theory would proceed is say, well, what's the difference between those two? And if the difference is all about terms of trade manipulation, then that's the purpose of trade agreements, to eliminate terms of trade manipulation. And one way that we could solve those two problems is we could take the so-called primal approach and just suppose it's a social planner in each country that just chooses the quantities, just chooses the allocations. And then after it chooses the allocations, it decentralizes the allocation by choosing some taxes to, in a market setting, to get everybody to do exactly what it wants. Well, that second step is the market economy that we typically assume. But if we took one of those countries and said that country doesn't do that second step, it actually implements those allocations directly through some fiat means, nothing in the theory would change, right? Because however that country implements the allocations that it wants within its borders, and the trade with other countries, at the end of the day, it's facing the same supply and demand equilibrium conditions in the world market as the other country. Whether it puts those quantities out there and says, I'm exporting, this is my export supply, this is my import demand, what's the equilibrium relative to your export and supply and import demand, what are the prices that are going to clear the world market. Those are unchanged, whether the country, sets those export supplies and import demands by ultimately using market principles within this country to ship those quantities out onto the world market, or whether it just directly chooses all of those quantities. So what that fundamentally means is the purpose of the trade agreement is the same, whether China is going to implement its allocations with a fiat system or with a market decentralized system. It's still about terms of trade manipulation. And if it's still about terms of trade manipulation, then the fundamental thing that the WTO needs China to do is make consistent and credible market access commitments. And so that's the question that we need to think about, is how could China make market access commitments that are reliable if in fact it is a system where if China commits to some tariff reductions, that is not necessarily going to do what you would think it would do in a market economy, because China can always undo that by all sorts of China Inc. means. And but that changes fundamentally and kind of organizes the problem that we face and that the world trading system faces for China, and that is just have to figure out a way to translate its tariff findings into secure market access commitments. That's the problem. We don't need China to change its system to a market economy. We just need to find ways that China could make these market access commitments in a secure way. And when looked at in that way, it's in China's interest to do this as well, because just like it's in any country's interest to want to be part of a trade agreement that can actually improve every country's welfare by internalizing these terms of trade externalities. China, if put that way and said, what we really need is for you to tell us what is the way to make secure market access commitments, not for you to tell us how you're going to become a market economy, that changes the discussion, changes the entire negotiation. So what, how could we do that? Well, we could do that in some clauses of the GATT, the WTO, that are already there for precisely this kind of thing. And the interesting clause that this implicates is the non-violation clause. So what the non-violation clause is in the GATT, and it's also in the WTO, is a really interesting clause that essentially acknowledges the incompleteness of the GATT contract. And what it says is we're going to be negotiating tariff bindings with countries, and we know that the meaning of those are supposed to be market access commitments. And then we have a bunch of articles that are going to try to keep other policies from undercutting those market access commitments. And those are all explicit rules. But we also know that this contract is very incomplete, and we may not actually explicitly be able to write in every possible way that a country could undercut its market access commitments with creative and artful ways of getting around the rules and yet still diminishing the commitments it makes. So in the original GATT, the so-called non-violation clause was included in addition to the violation clause. So the violation clause would be, if you actually violate one of the rules, I can go to the court and say you violated this rule. But the non-violation clause says, well, you didn't actually violate any rule, but the activity that you did, the measures that you took, had the implication of undercutting my reasonable expectations of the market access that I thought you were committing to under our reciprocal negotiation. And what the non-violation clause then allows is if a country succeeds in that non-violation clause, or the claimant, then the defendant has two choices. Since it's not a violation, they don't have to change their policies. But if they don't change their policies, then the WTO authorizes the claimant to go ahead and reestablish reciprocity by raising up its tariffs against that country. So the whole purpose is things were out of balance in terms of reciprocity because of some non-violation. And so one way or another, we got to get ourselves back to reciprocity. Either the defendant should find a way to give that market access that it's not doing, or that's okay if it doesn't want to, but then the claimant gets to raise up. And that's the non-violation idea. So how would that work in the case of China? Well, suppose the US and the EU and maybe other countries brought a non-violation clause against China that said, at the time of your accession and our accession negotiations in 2001, we actually expected reasonably at the time that you were moving toward a market economy. And we thought that the commitments that you negotiated, the tariff bindings, plus a few extra rules, there were some extra rules like the prohibition on export restrictions that China agreed to that other countries don't agree to in the WTO. But we thought that those rules, in combination with your movement toward a market economy that we anticipated, would deliver reciprocity, that basically your permanent normal relations with us, which was going to give you a bunch of more access into our markets, would have the equivalent trade effect of what you're doing for us, these lowering of tariffs and some prohibitions on export restrictions. But our reasonable expectations were frustrated by the fact that you didn't evolve to a market economy, and in fact, don't have any intention of doing that. And therefore, you need to do something. We need to realize that we have a problem here. We have this non-reciprocal relationship going on. And either you need to make more credible market access commitments, and you can find a way to do it, however you want to do it, or you don't have to do it. If you feel that given the system of economics that you want in your country, there's just no way to make more market access commitments than you've made, that's okay. You're still a fine member of the WTO, but then we're going to have the right to unilaterally back off on what we gave you. And the WTO rules would allow that. So the upside of that is it gives China a lot of leeway to decide what is the best way for us not to move to a market economy. That's not the issue anymore. The issue is, what's the best way for us to find a way to make credible market access commitments to the rest of the world? That's what everyone's doing in the WTO. We're not being asked to do anything different than anybody else. It's just that we have a different market system. And so the normal rules of GATT, which would work for market economies, aren't working for us, and we need to do something else. So it turns out, that's not such a crazy pie in the sky idea, to do that. And all we have to do is look back at history, and there are plenty of market economies, non-market economies that did join the GATT and the WTO. So China's not the first. What China is the largest and most important by far. So that's definitely something different. And in the WTO era, many of the non-market economies that joined did explicitly say, we are moving toward a market system. That view was embedded in their protocols of accession, that they were moving toward a market system so that the articles of accession could have maybe some temporary provisions, but basically there was the view that within 5 or 10 years, these economies, Vietnam, et cetera, who joined after the WTO was created, they would be acting just like most market economies, and all the normal rules plus their tariff findings would deliver reciprocity. But there were some, and Poland is a great example, who joined in 1968, who didn't. There was no view at that time that Poland was going to become a market economy. It was a non-market economy who joined the GATT. And so let's look at Poland's article of accession. These are the two critical paragraphs, and this is it, really, the article of accession relative to, all the things you might think, we need to do with China. It was a quantity commitment, right? So it says, subject to paragraph 2 below, we'll get to that in a second, Poland shall, with effect from the date of this protocol, undertake to increase the total value of its imports from the territories of contracting party by not less than 7% per annum. So the view was, we expect that when Poland joins the GATT, its exports to GATT members is going to grow by about 7% per annum. And so Poland is just explicitly committing to a reciprocity commitment in terms of import volumes. And you might say, well, that's managed trade, and yeah, it is managed trade, and you wouldn't advocate that for market economies, but if you're a non-market economy, why not? It's not a crazy idea, and so this isn't a crazy idea for China to be considering. That maybe part of their commitment for accession to get reciprocity should be quantity commitments, because they can't credibly make market type commitments that would have the same effect. Yeah.
Said that a quantity commitment like this wouldn't make sense for a market economy, but why not?
Yeah.
Why couldn't market economies negotiate this sort of thing?
Right.
It would be equivalent to a tariff.
Right.
It doesn't seem to have any more cumbersome features than a tariff would.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think part of the answer is, the devil's in the details. So this is a commitment to increase its imports by 7% per annum from contracting parties. It doesn't say who it's going to be importing from. That's one thing. It also doesn't say what it's importing from. So there's a worry here. If you were to apply this to everybody, there would be a worry that, well, there's a lot of ability, a wiggle room here for like sort of non-market principles to a country could say, okay, fine, we'll import our required amount, but we're going to do it all from friends and not from enemies, or we're going to do it on certain products that that we don't think are strategic in some sense.
But didn't Poland on top of this then negotiate bilateral contracts with GATT members?
No, this was it for its.
There was something beyond.
Yeah, so this was it. So you're absolutely right that's not necessarily all that China would do. But what I'm suggesting is this could be part of what China does, and then there could be other things. Exactly, there could be other things, maybe some sector specific. But those could be in quantity terms too. Some of those could be in policy terms. Some of it could be, well, we will agree. Like they did already in 2001, they did agree to some restrictions on export restrictions. They agreed not to pose export restrictions on certain, key minerals, things like that, which no other WTO member had done. That was a first. So you can imagine some more of that. but then maybe combine, I'm putting this out because it's sort of an extreme way that in the GATT history, that was how a non-market economy was dealt with, just to suggest that, there are ways thinking outside the box where China could be asked to do things which are far away from saying you need to move to a market economy, because that's what the world needs of you if you want to be a good member of the WHO. And that's what, the terms of trade theory of thinking about this says, no reason for that. Purpose of the trade agreement is the same. So, all we really need to do is get them to make a secure market access commitment. And this might be part of that. Yeah, over. Great question. Poland did follow through. There were then, so here's the second part. Let's get to that second paragraph. So 3 years later, on January 1, 1971, and thereafter, on the date specified in paragraph 1 of Article 28, Article 28 is the renegotiation clause, which we're going to come to again in a minute, of the general agreement. Poland may, by negotiating an agreement with contracting parties, modify its commitments under paragraph 1. So in other words, suppose Poland said, well, after 3 years, we were committing to 7% imports, and in fact, our exports only grew by 2%. So this is not reciprocal for us, and we would like to renegotiate this commitment. Article 28 says you can do that, and then what does it say? It says, should this negotiation not lead to agreement between Poland and the other parties? So Poland says, look, we're importing 7% growth every year, we're only exporting 2%. We need to reduce our import commitment down to 2%. And suppose the US and other countries said, maybe 5%, but not 2%. And so we don't come to agreement. Then what? Then can the US and the EU hold up Poland and say, sorry, you agreed at 68 and we're not letting you change it? No, this is where Article 28 is, the structure of it's really important, because it says, should this negotiation not lead to agreement between Poland and the contracting parties, Poland shall nevertheless be free to modify the commitment. So Poland, and later how much time do you need to spend negotiating in good faith? Like 3 months, 3 to 6 months. And if you can't reach an agreement, Poland could just do it anyway and say, sorry, we're going to reduce our import growth to 2%. And then other countries are free to modify, contracting parties shall then be free to modify equivalent commitments. Meaning, well, if Poland is now going from 7% to 2%, other countries can say, well, you went down to 2%, so now we can modify our commitments. Though, given that they were only importing from Poland 2%, that reciprocity has essentially been established. So they really don't have any ability at that point to do anything, because Poland's just establishing reciprocity. Okay, so that's some of this did happen after in the 70s. There were working parties to say, how is this working? It wasn't so much. There was a little bit of argument over whether Poland's 7% per annum import growth was actually occurring. But more of the question was about the countries it was occurring from, and whether Poland was unfairly guiding some of its imports to certain groups and not others. And so there was a debate about whether this should be an MFN or whether it should be a country by country commitment. And those went on for a bit. But I think the bottom line is, yeah, it essentially worked in the sense that Poland was a member of good standing, and then ultimately did move toward a market economy, but wasn't expected at this time. Okay, so that's a way of thinking how the terms of trade theory would suggest that China could be handled. And the kind of the key insight, and what kind of gives us traction here from the theory, is this simple point that there's no reason to think that a non-market economy is fundamentally inconsistent with the world trading system as defined by the WTO. It's really all about what kind of market access commitments can be made in a credible way and finding ways. Okay, second issue that arises because of the emergence of these large developing countries is that industrialized countries may need to reconsider some of the level of the market access commitments that they agreed to in 1995. So if we think of back, the MFN tariff commitments that the U.S. has, it agreed to in 1995. That's the last time we had a successful multilateral round. So those tariffs were implemented in 1995, the tariff cuts. And at that point, China and the other emerging developing markets hadn't really yet emerged. So you can imagine that over the 20 years or so, 25 years since 1995, there was a big surprise for the U.S. and other countries, other industrialized countries, that in fact the market access levels that they committed to, they didn't anticipate the kinds of dislocation in labor markets and rural communities that were going to be either caused by trade or at least allowed by trade, given technology changes or whatever other things that were also happening that were changing the welfare of low wage workers and communities that were built on textiles and built on steel. So it could be that industrialized countries have experienced a significant increase in income inequality. And if so, they may want to reconsider some of the existing tariff commitments they have. And Article 28, which is what we just described in the protocol for Poland, actually, would provide the liability rule structure to achieve efficient breach of tariff commitments made in 1995. So the idea is, if you didn't have Article 28, and maybe think of Brexit, there is no such thing as Article 28 in the EU agreement. Okay, so Brexit, there was no fallback that Brexit could say, okay, that Britain could say, we don't like exactly what happened with our membership in the EU, and we want to exit, but we're going to negotiate the terms with you, and we're going to negotiate in good faith for a while. But if you don't agree, then we can still do it under terms that are defined in our in our contract. I mean, they can leave, but that's it. They can't. There's no middle ground. Article 28 is can be viewed as essentially the liability rule structure of it can essentially be viewed as a way of trying to facilitate efficient breach. And the efficient breach would say, look, it may be that given our market, given the unanticipated degree of injury that we have to our workers in our country or certain local labor markets, we know that we should be using other policies. We should be using income supplements, retraining, lump sum transfers if we had them. Those would all be first best or better than tariff. But once we don't have first best instruments, we know from theory that in the second best world, actually you should be using every instrument you have a little bit. Like there's nothing that says a tariff of all instruments should be off the table, and you should use everything else if you don't have lump sum instruments to help your injured workers, but never use a tariff. That's crazy, right? Yeah, tariff is a second best instrument, just like a wage subsidy is a second best instrument, just like retraining, is a second best. All these things are not if you literally just cared about the income of workers and you had lump sum instruments, you would do that, and then you'd set all your other instruments to the first best level. But once you don't have that, a tariff could easily be part of a policy. It shouldn't be the centerpiece. Trade economists would certainly argue, me included, but it's not unreasonable to think it could be part of a policy in some industries. And Article 28 gives you that ability to basically say, we found out that the market access commitments we made, even once we fix this problem, so now we're reciprocal. And notice, fixing this problem might actually make this problem worse. So if China says, okay, we will establish reciprocity, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to import more from you and export, so that the amount of our imports and our exports are the same. If China lowers its tariffs, that is like lowering its export taxes. That's the learner symmetry. And so there's no reason to think that it's not possible that in fact there are going to be more exports from China coming in after we establish reciprocity than before. So there could be more injury even than we counted on once we fix the reciprocity problem. But once we fix the reciprocity problem, then the question is conditional on reciprocity. Does the US and Europe, do they want to move up and have less market access, or do they want to have more as long as it's balanced? And that's what Article 28 allows us to do. So this slide here is trying to break apart two problems with China that are often conflated. One is the lack of reciprocity, saying, look, China just didn't deliver the reciprocity. Everyone delivers that. And the other is all the injury from the China shock that we might say, you know, even if China had delivered reciprocity, we can't handle this. This was something that was just a surprise, and we need to renegotiate. This one is essentially a unilateral policy adjustment. Either China liberalizes more to establish reciprocity, or the US liberalizes less, but it's unilateral to get their balance. This is a reciprocal thing that both China and the US will go up. If the US wants to go up, China's going to go up too. And so, you know, just logically making this point, to me anyway, is a really important point for thinking about the negotiations with China. And if one separates this problem from this problem, and with this problem separating, you know, market access from telling them you have to turn into a market economy, that alone logically could make a huge amount of traction for trying to solve these problems. Okay, but the bottom line is, from an institutional perspective, this is a non-violation clause thing, which is about a unilateral adjustment. And this is an Article 28 thing, which is about a reciprocal adjustment. And that's where the institution is actually really well designed to map to these problems. If we just acknowledge these are the problems, then we can target each part of the institution as it already exists to help solve those problems. Okay, and then there's a third problem. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, you know, countries that are not economy are in a sense more vulnerable. They don't have control. What they import. So the case would be China will allow imports of the type that it considers to be non-threatening, and that will not allow imports of other industries. For instance, if it wants to support, it has an agenda of achieving some technological advantage in certain areas. It will block any import from that to protect the stage in which industries are making the growth process of achieving some technological advantage. While similar firms in the States can say, look, we can't do that because we are subject to imports, and the risk is too high to develop something.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And here's what I would respond to that is actually industrialized countries could do that because the tariff is totally negotiable in the GATT and the WTO. Every country decides what tariffs it wants to offer. It's not, no one is required to lower their tariffs. So if the US decided, you know what, steel is a critical industry, maybe it wasn't 30 years ago, but now we think it is, or chips, or whatever you want. The US could say, okay, we had this low tariff on steel and on semiconductors. We're actually going to renegotiate that now. We can't upset reciprocity, but we are going to raise our tariff to protect that infant industry. We need that stuff. So just like China could do it at that level, they're on the equal footing. China could do it by fiat, perhaps, and that's why we need to have something else than tariffs to handle China's goals. But the US could do it by a tariff, and the EU could too. So in that sense, I would argue they actually are on equal footing. And there's a question of which each country wants to do. And maybe the US, maybe they would say, look, this is silly to think of steel, well, maybe the Biden administration would say, actually, maybe not even the Biden administration. It's more like Trump on trade than we might have thought. But certainly earlier administrations might have said it's silly to think of steel as a strategic industry. We can import it from Canada. They're one of our allies in Europe. Whereas China might say, no, for us, it really is strategic. And that's part of a member-driven aspect of the WTO and that, which is they don't tell member governments what they should do. They take their needs and their preferences as given, and then they say, how can we figure out a negotiating forum that allows everyone to feel that they've gained? And so there could be differences of opinion across countries about whether a particular industry is strategic or not, and that will be reflected in the tariffs and or the fiat direction. But that's all okay, provided we continue to establish reciprocity, because reciprocity is basically that magic bullet that is saying, as long as you're making choices that are reciprocal, then you're not making those choices because of the effects on terms of trade, because reciprocity is kind of holding that terms of trade fixed. And so you're making them for the right reasons, not because part of the cost is being paid by somebody else. You're making them because you just feel that way.
Yeah, but this gives rise to question what precisely does reciprocity mean? So say I'm importing steel and wheat, decide that for some reason I need to practice my domestic steel industry. So I raise the tariff, let's say I raise the tariff on steel, but I lower it on wheat, so that overall I'm importing the same amount of stuff from you.
Yep.
As before.
Yep.
Does that give you the right to raise your tariffs against me, or do we say that that's really just the status quo?
Right.
Because the total imports haven't changed.
Yeah.
So more precisely,
Right.
what is meant by
Yeah, that's a
reciprocity?
great question. And in the GATT and the WTO, in principle, your example would be reciprocal. In other words, and in fact, it's explicit in the GATT Article 28 language, that when you're renegotiating and you're raising a tariff on something, you are to endeavor to lower the tariff on something else to keep the overall trade imports the same. And that's the hope, is that you don't deny overall market access, but it's just to endeavor to do that. And if you offer them wheat, when you're raising the tariff on steel and I offer you wheat and you say, that's not enough because, I'm not so interested in wheat, I'm interested in steel, then I can still do that. And then the question is, what can you do? And what you can do is you can withdraw equivalent concessions. So then we get to this exact question is, well, would the equivalence be, okay, if we had two-way trade in steel, the equivalence might be sector specific. Like you might say, what I'm really going to do is I'm going to also withdraw my tariff on steel. Like maybe I was importing low quality steel from you and you were exporting high quality steel from me. So there was two-way trade in steel, and I'm gonna withdraw equivalent concessions, but the way I'm going to do it is not from steel to wheat, but steel to steel, and that's my right. I can do that. So there is that aspect, and then that does raise the question. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? From the theory, that would be fine, because what it would say is, well, as long as that also stabilized the terms of trade, then what I was originally doing couldn't have been about trying to manipulate the terms of trade, because my overall terms of trade is not changing, whether you retaliate on the equivalent way on steel or on wheat. Either way, my terms of trade doesn't change. And so if I wanted to do this, it must be because of my own reasons, and then we allow that. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, so then the last problem is kind of an interesting one, which is what co-author Kyle Bagwell and I have called the latecomers problem. And that's the following. So remember yesterday, we talked about how reciprocity and MFN could cut out the third party externalities if you negotiate through reciprocity. So let's think of it again in our three-country two-good model, general equilibrium model. It's the easiest way to think of this point. And so I'm negotiating with Eric, and we have Alberto, and Alberto and Eric are exporting steel to me, so I'm importing steel from them, and I'm exporting wheat to them. And in the three-country two-good general equilibrium model, Alberto and Eric don't trade, but we can generalize this to more goods than everyone trades, or in a world where there's two-way trade. We have trade with every pattern. Okay, so now let's suppose that Alberto is a developing country, and Eric and I are industrialized countries in the GATT years. And what GATT said early on in its history was it said, you know what, there's a lot of developing country members who are struggling with their industrialization, et cetera. So we're not going to ask them to reciprocate in these bargains. We're going to give them a free pass, and we're going to call that special and differential treatment, which means when we have a round, and remember there were 8 of them, 8 rounds over the years from 1947 to 1995, we have a round of multilateral negotiations. Many of those rounds were just bilateral negotiations between countries that extended to everybody on an MFN basis. We will have in a given round, we'll say to Alberto, you don't have to be at the bargaining table. You don't have to offer up anything because you're developing, and we know that you have difficulties lowering your tariffs. You need tariffs for revenue, all sorts of reasons, infant industry, whatever you want. So when Eric and I negotiate, you're going to get something though, because whatever we agree to, we're doing it on an MFN basis. So we're offering you for free our tariff cuts. So we're going to go, Eric and I go from 30% or 25% on average down to 4% through these 50 years of negotiation. We continue to negotiate our tariffs down, and we're offering those tariff cuts to Alberto, and Alberto's sitting on the sideline. So the question is, what is Alberto getting out of this? The idea is the MFN, he should be getting free access to our markets, and his exporters should be exporting more. But it turns out, if you think about the logic of reciprocity, if Eric and I do our cuts reciprocally, the world price isn't going to change. And if the world price doesn't change and Alberto's tariff doesn't change, then his local prices won't change, and nothing in Alberto's market changes. In other words, he's not going to get any more exports into our market. He's not going to import anymore. And his total welfare, the distribution of income, the absolute level of income stays put. And that's the notion, the logic of reciprocity plus MFN kills third-party effects, right, of negotiation. So let's think of how could that work economically? How could it possibly be that when Eric and I are negotiating, I'm importing steel from both Alberto and Eric, and I'm lowering my steel tariff from 30% to 2%. How is it possible that Alberto isn't getting any more steel exports into my market? Like, what's wrong with his steel producers? He could tell his companies, what's wrong with you guys? The US has lowered its steel tariff from 20 to 2, and you guys aren't selling any more steel. And the problem is that Eric is cutting his tariff on wheat. And think of Lerner symmetry in our typical trade model. That means he's basically cutting his export tax on steel. So Alberto is having to compete with a more formidable exporter into my market. So yes, my market demand is growing. As my steel tariff goes down, I want more steel from the world. But Eric is becoming more and more of a competitive steel exporter. And reciprocity, if we do this reciprocally, is just balancing those two so that Alberto just continues to sell the same exact quantity into my market. And Eric fills all of my new demand. And that's what reciprocity plus MFN does. And so you think, on the one hand, that's really amazing. And kind of, first you think that can't be. But then when you think through it in a simple model, you say, yeah, of course, these two balancing effects of if the country that I'm exporting into cuts its tariff, that's good for me. I'm going to expand my exports. But if a competing exporter cuts its tariff, that's bad for me. And those two guys can balance it. So the good and the bad just equal out, and I get nothing. So great for bargaining, because it really does say, well, that's a way to decentralize the bargain. You can put it into a bunch of bilaterals and no one's going to have externalities then. And that's, sort of amazing. And that's kind of what, the Curzon quotes and the empirical work that we focused on yesterday suggested, yeah, that actually does seem to go on. On the other hand, what about these developing countries? They were supposed to be getting all this freebies for 50 years. And according to the theory, they're not getting much. And they actually, people who have looked at what developing countries are getting, it's true. They're not getting much from their membership. They're getting from their joining. They want the MFN. If they weren't a member, they wouldn't have MFN, and then they're definitely being hurt by what's going on in the WTO, or in the GATT. But once they're a member, they get nothing from the process if it's a process of reciprocity. So that suggests that here we are today when the Doha round was started in 2001, it was called the Doha Development Round. And part of the reason it was the development round was the view that developing countries really have not shared in the gains from this ongoing process of trade liberalization, and the WTO has to find a way to help them share. So you can kind of see, this is just a quick map saying these are average levels of tariffs, and they're kind of, broad categories, so it doesn't really do justice, but basically the US and Canada and most of Europe are pretty low. Russia is somewhat low, and that's partly because Russia joined late. It exceeded in 2005 or 6. And so it was asked to do a lot when it joined. But many countries like India and the African countries and Brazil and South America, many of these countries were, and Central America, many of these countries were original GATT members, and they didn't have to do anything. And so their tariffs, this is a picture of the deeper red is the higher tariffs. Their tariffs are quite high, whereas the industrialized countries' tariffs are quite low. And the question is, under reciprocity, how are you gonna help the developing countries join in and gain? Because ultimately, the gains from negotiation in the GATT under reciprocity and MFN is all about your own liberalization, right? You're not getting gains from world price movements; those aren't changing. So it's all about, I gain because when I liberalize, I'm eliminating distortions, and those are good for me. And those distortions were in there because I was pursuing terms of trade benefits. But if I get somebody else to liberalize with me, terms of trade are fixed, and that's why I want to liberalize. But the gains then are what you get is what you get, right? That is like the structure of the GATT negotiation. And it makes total sense because that's the source of the Pareto improving gains anyway. Movements in the world price are just redistribution across countries. So the GATT has been is good at focusing on negotiating on what you gain, but the special and differential treatment meant that all these countries that weren't doing anything essentially didn't get any gains other than their initial joining to get in that. So here we are in a world where we've got industrialized countries, tariffs are already low, they've done what they needed mostly, and we've got developing countries and emerging markets who are tariffs are high, but now they're big enough and powerful enough that they have the ability to have distortions from the terms of trade movements and their tariffs, and we got to figure out a way to solve this quote unquote latecomers problem. Right? These are the countries that come late to the table, and everyone else has already done their stuff. Well, they can negotiate with each other. That's some of what they do. So developing and developing countries can, but a lot of the trade, is and should be north-south, and they can't find much to do to reciprocally negotiate with the north or with the industrialized country. So the Doha round, unfortunately, did two things. First of all, it reestablished the special and differential treatment clause. It said, we're going to try to help developing countries, but we know that developing countries are in different circumstances, so we're not going to expect reciprocity of them. And according to the terms of trade theory, that game over right there. If you're not going to expect reciprocity, then how do you think that these guys are going to gain from the negotiations? Because if the industrialized countries are going to still try to do whatever they do on a reciprocal and MFN basis, they're not going to get anything from that. And if you're not asking these countries to do much or anything, the gains are not there. So one thing that the terms of trade theory would suggest is, well, the Doha round which was suspended and hasn't regrouped, was kind of ill-fated from the start if it wanted to help developing countries. But you really need to find a way to get developing countries at the table. And but then the question is, well, how do you do that given that the industrialized countries' tariffs are so low? And that again is where you could imagine that Article 28 could be a critical component of that. And that is, what do we need here conceptually? What we would like to do is say, let's suppose we blew up the WTO. Everybody just went back to NASH, and then we started over with the world as it is today, with China and India, and South Africa, and Brazil, and all these major developing countries as major trade powers now. If we started there, where would we negotiate to? Like in a reciprocal way, where could we get to? And that's where we would kind of like the WTO to get us, not constrained by the history of reciprocal negotiation of industrialized countries. Well, to do that, that suggests that what you need is you need to do kind of a two-step round, where first there has to be some Article 28 renegotiations among industrialized countries. So the US and Europe perhaps raise up tariffs that they had negotiated with each other and that they're principal suppliers to, in order that they can then turn to China and Brazil and India and reciprocally lower them back down. So in the US, maybe the tariffs ultimately would be the same, but now India's tariffs would be lower based on the reciprocal negotiation. And that kind of reorienting of the pattern of tariffs across the world would reorient trade, right? It would tend to reorient bilateral trade more toward north-south than it currently is today. And how would it do it? Just because it would ultimately lower a bunch of the tariffs of developing countries through this negotiation. And what would these developing countries gain? Yeah, because that's how you do gain. If this was all done in a way that fixed world prices aren't moving, and then it's just a question of who is going to share in the gains from their own liberalization. And now you're just moving some of that distribution of the gain toward the countries who, if we started with WTO today, they would have had it to begin with. Okay, so that's the kind of logic of what a overall round, that if we really wanted to help the developing world, once you see that the logic of gains from negotiated trade liberalization is really about what you give, that's what you get. Right? Because the world prices aren't going to change according to reciprocity, nor should they really. That would just be redistribution. Then it really is a question of how do we get developing countries to reciprocally liberalize. No one was ever expected to unilaterally liberalize in the WTO, so we can't ask them to do it on their own. But we could ask them to negotiate if we had the space, the tariff space as industrialized countries. Okay, so that's a long-winded way of saying those are like three interrelated issues that the terms of trade theory kind of helps you sort through, and it kind of points institutionally to certain things and how you in this case you would use Article 28, the renegotiations, together with Article 28 bis. Well, that's the article that says this is how we have a round negotiating down. It's under Article 28 bis, whereas Article 28 is how do you go up if you need to backtrack. And you can imagine that this kind of thing might help. Of course, there's I'm smoothing over a lot of caveats. If you were to say seriously, you're actually talking about having the U.S. and Europe, renegotiate some tariffs on certain products, autos or steel, back up to 20%, in order to then go to India and China and Brazil and negotiate back down. Well, what if the second part failed and then we got 20% tariffs? That would be a really bad thing. So yes, this is not something that you would take lightly, but it's the kind of logic that is suggested by in terms of trade theory view of the problem, of the institution, and of how you can use the institution to fix the problem. Yeah, Eric.
I'm inspired by this argument.
Sorry, did you say you're not completely clear?
Well, here's the problem I have.
Yeah.
Say the US and Europe raise their tariffs.
Mhm.
That's certainly going to make the developing countries worse off than they were.
Not if they do it reciprocally, right? And that's backing up from the same point before. Is as long as the U.S. and Europe do it reciprocally and extend on an infinite basis, then Alberto is still sitting there with the same exports to me that he had when you and I reciprocally liberalized. So Alberto actually doesn't care until I then turn to Alberto and say, now I got a high tariff and I want to negotiate with you, and then he starts to gain. Yeah, so perhaps part of what you're talking about is, I'm telling you this in the simplest possible model of 3 countries, 2 goods. And of course, in reality, there's a lot more complication of, we have many countries, many goods. And when we start to do things reciprocally, then the issue that you raised before is, well, when you say reciprocity, does that mean that some world prices could go up as long as others go down? And in that case, there could be some countries that are having, if I was only exporting one of the goods to you and the world price went down, then I'm going to export less. There'll be other countries that are exporting more because they're exporting where the world price goes up. And overall, the countries will not be hurt. But yes, there could be, in a more complicated setting, there could be distributional impacts across countries that you would have to worry about, and either define reciprocity in a more narrow way, or if you didn't define it in a more narrow way, then acknowledge that, yeah, there'd be that first process would hurt some countries and help others, because some of the world prices would change, even if reciprocally overall the trade weighted average didn't change. So yeah, I think that may be what you're pointing out is I'm glossing over the complications if you would actually implement this that you'd have to deal with, and just trying to kind of focus on the broad idea that's there. Okay, let's go to climate change. I go to 10:30. Okay. I may not get through more than these slides, but that's okay. I'll try to get to the Greta thing for a little while. So what about accommodating efforts to address climate change? So the claim is that the WTO is actually well suited to accommodate efforts. And here's the way to think about it. Let's suppose, that in the ideal world, that countries found a way to negotiate a forcible climate accord that implements an increase in carbon taxes that's necessary to solve our problem. Let's just suppose that for a minute. And then, according to the terms of trade theory, the question that we could ask is GATT's shallow approach to integration able to accommodate these new carbon taxes that everyone's put on, or do we, is it essentially incompatible with the way GATT handles things? And I think the argument is yes, it is compatible, provided that carbon border adjustments are used to offset the competitive effects that the implementation of higher carbon taxes would create for each country. So on the one hand, if we want to think about, do carbon border adjustments, which are another name for tariffs essentially, that countries impose, is that going to be fundamentally WTO inconsistent? The answer from the terms of trade theory is absolutely not. In fact, it's exactly what you would want in order to maintain the efficiency that the WTO had reached, before you had the climate problem. Once people put on carbon taxes to fix the climate problem, you'd want to have carbon border adjustments that basically offset the competitive effects of those taxes, those carbon taxes. So the role of carbon border adjustments, according to the theory, resonates with the role as seen from the perspective of the policy debate. Namely, it's a mechanism for addressing the trade competitiveness impacts and the carbon leakage concerns that arise when a country considers implementing more stringent carbon policies. Because if I put on these carbon taxes and you don't, what I'm worried about is, my dirty industry will just go to your country. If not literally through FDI, then it will just go through trade, and you'll start exporting to me a bunch of this dirty steel. And that's the carbon leakage. But if I use a carbon border adjustment to offset that, I can say, well, I'm going to raise my tariff a bit so that your steel exporters to me are just facing the same conditions of competition with my guys as they were before. Now my guys have to pay a carbon tax, but they also get a higher tariff, and we're using those to just keep the market access or conditions of competition exactly unchanged, and that's perfectly consistent with the logic of the GATT and the WTO. But there's a really interesting difference relative to what proposals are out there, like CBAM. That's the European carbon tax that's currently on the table, or carbon border adjustment that's currently on the table. And that is that these carbon border adjustments can be MFN. They don't have to depend on the carbon content of the production of the foreign country. So Europe does not need to impose a higher tax on goods coming from China because China is producing with really dirty stuff, whereas I can impose a lower tax on the US because the same steel coming from the US is much cleaner. According to this, it's an MFN tariff. And why is it an MFN tariff? Well, because the point of the tariff is to offset the competitive effects of my own carbon tax. And that has to do with my own carbon content. If my guys are clean, the carbon tax doesn't do much. If they're dirty, it really does a lot. And so I need to have a tariff that adjusts that. But it's immaterial about what everybody else is doing. It has nothing to do with dirty versus clean. And so from a pure trade perspective, a pure market access perspective, there's a nice strong argument for against what is a really controversial part of in developing countries of the CBAM proposal and others like it, which is this is going to kill exports from China and other countries that are producing in a dirty way. And they feel that this is not fair because we didn't create the problem. For 100 years, you guys have been creating the problem, and now we're finally industrializing, and you're going to hit us with these high taxes that are going to kill us in trade. Well, this is saying actually, according to the terms of trade theory, you can separate that issue from the pure market access issue. From a pure market access perspective, just Europe should do it on an MFN basis, and it should only be based on their carbon border adjustment should be based on their own carbon content and not anybody else's. So an interesting thing is, well, you might say as an environmentalist, well, wait a minute, part of what Europe wants to do is incentivize China to clean up its act. And you're telling me that, this MFN carbon border adjustment, it won't penalize China any more than the US, even though China is producing steel in a really dirty way and the US in a clean way? And the answer is, yeah, because that's what a market access commitment is about. If you want to use your carbon border adjustments to try to force another country to adopt clean technology, that's a different problem, right? That's a different problem. That's an environmental problem. And you might want to do that, but that probably wouldn't be WTO consistent. Just like, as a WTO member, you can't necessarily, and legally, you basically can't, put a higher tariff on a country because it didn't join a certain convention for animal rights or something like that. So there are exceptions where you can, but generally speaking, that's not allowed. And from the terms of trade theory's perspective, that's right. You should be separating logically these problems. One problem is, how do you maintain the efficiency of the trade system in a world where you've got other problems like climate, and countries are going to adopt carbon taxes, and they're going to have competitive effects. And the WTO, the terms of trade theory would say, absolutely, there is a role for carbon border adjustments, but absolutely, it's an MFN role, and that can kind of separate the pure trade part of why you want a carbon border adjustment from the most controversial part of why you also might want a carbon border adjustment, that is to incentivize a dirty country to clean up. That's a separate issue, and one that I think, if this were separated in this way, I think it would be much less controversial that countries could do the MFN carbon border adjustment. That would probably fly through for most countries. And the question is, can they also do this other thing? Well, that's something that we could all think about. Maybe you should be able to punish countries who aren't helping in the fight for avoiding climate change, but that's our international non-pecuniary externality. That's a different problem in some sense that can be separated, right? Separated, and yet Yeah, that's a good question. So so I guess one way to say what you're saying is well, you might you might really want to argue for this is not enough, that you really do want to have carbon border adjustments that incentivize countries to do the right thing. And so I would only argue that yes, that may well be, but when you say the right thing, that's the right thing about a different externality than is the externality that is critical for the WTO, because the externality for critical for the WTO is a pecuniary externality. It's coming through markets. Whereas when you say the right thing, I think what you mean is the right thing from the point of view of the world climate. We really are going to be screwed if we can't get China somehow to clean up its act. And maybe this is our best way to do it, is a CBAM type proposal. But at least logically, even though I think reasonable people might build that on to the MFN and say you ought to do more, I think it helps to separate these two, at least to say, look, as a starting point, we should be able to agree that at least a carbon border adjustment on an MFN basis seems totally, it's hard to argue against it from this logic. And then the question is, okay, maybe it's more controversial whether we want to use tariffs as a weapon to solve the climate problem. That's kind of a more aggressive use, and maybe we do. And then it could have dynamics, dynamic aspects of that are clearly important. Yeah. Sorry, say it again. China. Right. So yeah. So then I think that would be the if they're producing steel that is dirtier than in the U.S., then the question is, what do we want to do to try to incentivize them not to do that? And that's where, yeah, we might want to impose a discriminatory tax against them, but in terms of the competitive effect of the European carbon tax on its own producers, it doesn't matter whether I'm getting steel from China and it's dirty or from the US and it's clean. The competitive effect of my steel tax or my carbon tax is all about my producers, because they're the ones that are going to have to pay it based on the carbon tax. And if they're not putting out much carbon, then their costs don't go up much. So that's why it's an MFN tax to handle the trade problem. So I don't know if that answers. I feel like you're asking something a little different, but I'm not. Yeah. Yeah. So the world price of steel is lower because China's not doing what it might have done to clean it up. Yeah. So let's think about it. That's a great question. So the question would be right. So yeah, that's a great question, because I think it really hits at the point here, and that is, let's suppose that this wasn't a global climate issue, but we're talking about local particulates. And China decides it doesn't care about the lung problems that its citizens are going to get. It's going to produce dirty stuff. Well, that's China's issue. As long as we don't care directly about the health of the Chinese worker, then we don't care. If China is willing to take this health cost and produce low-cost steel, we're fine with that. There's no, so we like low prices. I mean, those are good. And if I don't like them, I can always put a tariff on to block the local price effect. But low world prices are good. I get to import stuff lower. So the logic of your question really gets traction when we think, yeah, but what if what they're doing here is dropping down these world prices, but that's reflective of an international non-pecuniary externality that they're exploiting, which is they're putting out a lot of carbon, and that hurts all of us. Then that's when, yes, that is a problem, but then that is the non-pecuniary problem internationally. So agreed, that would, that would be an issue, and that's the question of then whether do we want to kind of incentivize them to do something for the climate reason as opposed to just the standard trade reason. If the externality were local, everything I said before would be true, and we wouldn't want to do anything. That'd be fine. Just let them do it, and we just want to do MFN for our own. But if it's global, then yes, and that's this distinction.
That's the main issue.
Yeah, right. And then that's the question is, well, so, and I think maybe reasonable people could differ. Like if I were in China, I might say, look, yeah, you would like us to clean up, but you got to give us carrots, not sticks. You can't punish us with a high tariff in order to make us clean up. If you really want us to clean up, then you should be transferring, free technology and giving us a bunch of transfers. And then, yeah, we could see doing that. And that's where I think reasonable people could differ. Whereas I think reasonable people, according to the terms of trade theory, wouldn't differ on the initial MFN part of the carbon border adjustment. That should be there just as a pure trade reason. You want that. So it's not like you don't want any carbon border adjustment. The question, according to this, is the debate should be about whether it should be MFN or whether it should be discriminatory. And then reasonable people could differ. You might say, yeah, we should have discriminatory because this is a huge problem and we need to incentivize China. And part of it should be with sticks and maybe part of it with carrots too. But a high tariff against them, I'm fine with that. That could be a reasonable position. Yeah.
Let's say we want to move like from the current status quo in European Union and US wants
Yeah.
to an MFN type. But if we need unanimity because we need some form of like treaty to write in the WTO.
Right.
This thing is off the table.
Yeah.
Why would the US and the European Union move to that?
Yeah.
Right? Because you want to bunch everything together to have more tools to negotiate.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that if the carbon border adjustment were done on an MFN basis, it could be done unilaterally. You don't need a special WTO permission because I think for example, here would be one way to do it. Article 28 renegotiation. You could say, okay. I am going to bring together the countries that are the principal suppliers of, say, steel to my market, and that originally negotiated this steel concession with me. And I'm going to tell you that I'm going to raise my steel tariff by 5%. And now, according to Article 28, I'm supposed to offer you some compensation. And then I could say, well, my compensation is I'm going to put a 20% carbon tax on steel production. And look, that cost is just being offset by the 5% tariff I'm raising. So that's my compensation, and it's reciprocal. You're going to be able to sell the same. I haven't changed the conditions of competition between your guys and mine, and that would be the nature of our Article 20 negotiation. Now you might disagree with me, and then I could do it anyway. But that would be the point. So that's one way to say, there are articles in the GATT, the WTO, that would allow me to just do this unilaterally, and it wouldn't take any new changes in the rules or anything like that. And that would be the logic of this. Yeah.
So the way I read that information on the position on this is that there are two different objectives. One is to kind of be more efficient and more efficient to make use the CBAM and an additional tool so that the commission can carbon to sectors that as of now are not covered because of the risk of carbon change. Avoid carbon change through the CBAM, then we can implement the strong carbon price in the internet market. And this I understand is compatible with the MFN.
Yeah.
And then there is a second thing that is about transition, but that is not necessary, which is also incentivized in other countries to also implement the I think in a way, correct that.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
What I'm saying is that CBAM should be pushed by the European Commission on the ground of the
Right.
so that it's consistent with
Exactly. I think that's a great way to put it. And then the kind of political argument is if you separate those two, you should be able to push through and do fairly non-controversial the first part, the MFN part. And then the question is, do you want to do the more aggressive second part? And that reasonable people could differ, and maybe you would need some changes in the WTO rules to allow you to do it. But this first part shouldn't be controversial in that. You should just move through and everyone should agree.
Then it needs to be kind of clear that the level of the tariff should be based on the current level of the carbon tax.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So which step is it possible to accurately measure carbon emissions? It isn't something that's quite easy to manipulate.
Yeah, yeah. So that's right. There are all these measurement issues, and that practically speaking, suppose that that we were to do this Article 28 negotiation that I mentioned, and the European Union were to come to other countries and say, look, we're going to raise our tariff on steel and certain other products on an MFN basis up 5%. And the reason we're doing that, you shouldn't worry, is that we're imposing an 8% or 20% carbon tax, and that's effectively offsetting the competitive effect. And then the other companies might say, well, wait a minute, show me the data. How do I know that the 5% tariff is actually going to offset? It seems like it's probably too much. Your carbon content, it's not clear to me that it's really as high as you say, and these companies may be able to get around paying the carbon taxes. So then, practically speaking, on implementation, absolutely, you've got these data issues, and so that would have to be something to deal with. Yeah, and I don't have much of anything to say about that other than this kind of basic point of whatever you do, try to do it MFN. That's a non-controversial, but I agree. There's issues that I'm glossing over for sure. Okay. Whoops, wrong way. All right. Okay. The only other thing on the climate, and this is a little out there, but it's a kind of an interesting point, I think. And this would allow the WTO to be more aggressive, not in its more aggressive on the climate stage. And that is, it might be a way to help the WTO solve two problems, which is its latecomers problem, which is, well, how do the industrialized countries have any tariffs to offer in exchange for the tariff cuts of the developing world? That was the latecomers problem with the climate problem. Because suppose that the US and the EU did impose these MFN carbon border adjustments. Those are MFN tariffs, right? So now the US has instead of a 2% tariff on steel, maybe it has a 7% tariff on steel. And it has this carbon tax, right? And that's so the carbon tax and the tariff make sure that the exports of steel into the US are still unchanged after that. But now it does have this instrument, this 7% steel tariff, that it could in principle turn to China and India and Brazil and say, well, now we got a tariff that if you want us to cut, we'd be willing to cut this tariff from 7% down to 2% if you liberalize on your end. So now you start to have tariff instruments that would would potentially allow some more reciprocal negotiation. And what this map is carbon imports and exports, and it's basically just showing that the red are the big carbon importers, products that use a lot of carbon, US and Europe, some Brazil too, but mainly the US and Europe. And the blue is the carbon exporter. So these are China, India, Russia, South Africa. And you can kind of see that, well, in that case, if the US puts an MFN tariff on the products that have a lot of steel, these are the ones that also have steel in other countries, then that's going to tend to hit these countries. Well, this would be energy, but these countries, and tend to hit them more, and they would presumably be willing to negotiate those very tariffs, those carbon border adjustments down by reciprocating with their own tariff cuts. So you can imagine that you could have a round in which after the US and the EU did their carbon taxes and they put their MFN carbon border adjustments on, then you had reciprocals, normal tariff negotiations about market access, and that would do two things. And then I'll take that question. The two things it could help solve the latecomers problem, because it would allow this asymmetry. You're basically putting two asymmetries together. One was the latecomers problem was, man, the developing countries don't have any tariffs, they want the developed countries don't have any tariffs to exchange. They want the developing countries to lower their tariffs. On the other hand, the climate problem is the developing world wants the developed world to do the work, not to have the developing world do it. And with the carbon border adjustments, the developed country is doing the work. They've got tariffs, and now they've evened out these tariffs, and now the tariffs can go down in a symmetric way. So it could potentially help solve the latecomers problem. And at the same time, it could help enforce the climate commitments. Because if you think about it, what the negotiation really would be is that China and India would be saying, we will lower our tariffs, provided you lower your carbon border adjustments. And the only reason your carbon border adjustments were that you had carbon taxes. And if you don't follow through on your carbon taxes, well, then you have not done your market access commitment. If your carbon taxes, don't follow through, then we're not going to follow through on our tariff lowering, and we're going to retaliate with higher tariffs against your lack of carbon tax commitment. So at the end of the day, the negotiations, really are about developing countries lowering their tariffs in exchange for the industrialized countries putting on carbon taxes without a carbon border adjustment. And that's the market access implications of the carbon taxes. They're giving more market access to the world, and the developing world is giving more market access in return by lowering its tariffs. So could help even with enforcement and kind of link trade to the carbon taxes in this enforcement way. Yeah, sorry. No, sorry, say again? Oh, okay, and Eric.
I just wanted to come back to the latecomer problem, the pure latecomer problem without
Looks like a screen. Yeah.
I put it. I had the wrong emphasis. Say the U.S. and raise their tariffs in order to for there to be something to negotiate with developing countries.
Yep.
And then the hope is that tariffs around the world will come down. But how do the U.S. and Europe know that they will be better off in final point than they were before they raised their tariffs?
Right. Yeah.
Since this all has to be done reciprocally.
Right.
I mean, I agree that there should be a better bargain,
Yeah.
but how do you know that this can be achieved reciprocally?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And on the one hand, according to the theory, we would know that the developing countries would definitely benefit.
They will be definitely better off.
Yeah, and then the question is, well, what about the U.S. and the EU? Because they're definitely worse off when they go up.
Right.
Then they turn to their southern partners and they go down. They could be, if they go, depending on how far they're able to go down and how far they went up with each other, the question is, are they going to be better off? And I think you're right. Is it guaranteed that they can find a way, all subject to reciprocity, this rigid reciprocity? Is it guaranteed that they can find a way to be better off? It's a great question. It seems like there ought to be some way to configure things so that everyone's better off, but I don't know.
Well,
I
I agree that there will be greater improving trade, but I just don't know that it can be done.
Exactly. In other words, you might have to change the world prices. That's the thing, is that to get to the efficiency frontier at a Pareto improving point, the world prices might have to change. And I think that's, it's a great point, because it's been hovering around everything I've been saying here. I've been kind of rigid about reciprocity, fixed world price. But in some ways, that's another way to think about where we are in the world today is, we use reciprocity very effectively for a while, and it does tend to fix the world prices, but there might come a point where things have changed enough that you've just got to reset the world prices, right? And then once you reset them at a different level, you can use reciprocity very effectively. But if the world has become really asymmetric in an existing set of world prices, you might not be able to get to the efficiency frontier. And that's something in theory that I didn't mention, but is definitely true. If you were to go rigidly with reciprocity, if the world were perfectly symmetric, you could go all the way to the efficiency frontier because everything's symmetric. But if the world is not asymmetric, you're going to be somewhat away from the efficiency frontier. And the further is the asymmetry in the world, where asymmetry can be defined as, for example, what would be the world price in the Nash equilibrium relative to where you get on the efficiency frontier. Then reciprocity may become too rigid a rule to allow you to go. So that's a long-winded way of saying you're absolutely right. We have to think about the world prices and whether they're fixed at the wrong level. And then that argues also for the possibility of why a possible role that a multilateral negotiation round can play. Because part of what the round does is not only have the bargains according to reciprocity, but it also brings in other issues. So every round brings in other things in addition to tariff negotiations, like TRIPS, the intellectual property agreement, and the agreement on investment, and things of that nature. And so one can kind of think of the round as a way of bringing in other issues to try to bring back a balance that, in some sense, kind of adjust the world price that we're trying to get down. But end of the day, yes, agreed. That it may be too rigid, and then one possibility is we need to be able to move away from reciprocity, and that's kind of partly where we may be going. Yeah.
I'm just curious if this argument you have on this slide has anything to say about, unlike carbon emissions from manufacturing, where we think that there's carbon taxes in industrialized countries are promising for something like deforestation, which is more spatially concentrated in Brazil and Indonesia, and where there's concern about, say, importing soy products that are manufactured, on deforested land. In that case, does this argument have anything to say about those kinds of discussions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think the short answer is I should know, and I'm not sure. I know of some recent work that focuses on deforestation and climate agreements and trade agreements that is really interesting, that I could mention to you afterwards. But yeah, I haven't thought about to what extent this has anything special to say about that. I have to think about that more. But as I mentioned, I know of at least one recent paper that you'd probably be interested in, so I'll let you know that afterwards. Okay, all right. I am out of time. So let me just conclude. I'll go very quickly here. Digital trade, I'm not even going to talk about, but it turns out that according to the terms trade theory, nothing has changed in the purpose of the trade agreement. So the WTO ought to be able to accommodate digital trade. Offshoring is an issue because, and here the simple point is, everything we've done so far, according to the terms of trade theory, is that international prices are the channel through which externalities occur. And those prices are determined by market clearing conditions. So as long as that's true, everything I said is true. But if you think of offshoring as the trade in very specialized inputs between an input supplier and an input demander, and those international prices are determined by bargaining as opposed to market clearing, then that's a different mechanism for which the externality moves through the world. It's not just market clearing condition, but it's the details of the bargain, like a Nash bargain or whatever. And that means that different instruments, different policies are actually going to be optimal for manipulating the outcomes of that bargain than just the tariff. The tariff is the first best instrument if you just have market clearing to manipulate the terms of trade. But if you have bargaining, then lots of instruments become optimal. And so the whole structure of shallow integration, which basically started from the view that the only problem is the tariff, everything else should be set in the way that the country wants to, that goes away because now the tariff is not the first best instrument if the prices are determined by bilateral bargaining, and things get more complicated. You may need a deep integration, and that's you can look at the slides, but there's some evidence that maybe that's what's going on. Countries who are more and more going into deep regional agreements are also the ones that are much more related, much more involved in global value chains and these kinds of trade relations. So that could affect, what kind of trade agreements needed. This is another effect that I'm just not going to have time to talk about. And then there's some elephants in the room. Sovereignty is a great question, and it's really hard to formalize. And I have some work with Kyle Bagwell that attempts to formalize it and makes the case that the WTO is pretty well designed to minimize sovereignty issues and achieve efficiency. There's also the question of whether the WTO needs a hegemon to survive. And this, I think, is really an interesting question now. As the US is becoming less and less dominant in the world, is it possible that a rules-based system is not going to be supported by the major players? And this gets at the issue that, well, it's kind of ironic that a rules-based system, why would a big player support a rules-based system if the rules basically take away the power of that country to, in power-based bargaining to get what it wants? And the argument that we made here with a co-author and related to other work with other co-authors is that the rules may be a way to commit to weak countries that you're not going to hold them up at the bargaining table. So if you're really, really big, you commit to some rules, and then countries will come in and join the global system. If you didn't commit, they would say, look, once we get there, we're going to be held to our ex post disagreement point, and it's not worth it to even invest. And so when the US was really dominant as a hegemon, it needed this rules-based system, as did the UK 100 years before, or 50 years before. But now we may be in this period where there's no country that's that dominant, and these powerful countries aren't so powerful. They don't really feel they need the rules to get participation. They can just exploit. And to some degree, it's really interesting to see what the Biden administration is doing with the Trump trade wars. You might have thought, well, Trump was an anomaly, but Catherine Tai just in the New York Times the other day explicitly said, well, these tariffs that Trump has imposed are good bargaining tools. So we're not going to take them off for nothing. And that's a power-based bargain, right? That's not the rules, because Trump put those on unilaterally. That was not within the rules of the WTO. But now that they're there, the Biden administration is saying, "Oh, they're not so bad. We'll take them off, but only when we get something." And so it could be that we're going to need the rise of another country, perhaps China, before we see the rules-based system really stabilizing again. Then there's that, and so there's my, that's just a summary, and the final thing that I showed you yesterday prematurely is that's the. Even despite the issues of offshoring, my view is there's a lot of good stuff in the way that the WTO is designed, and especially the gap before it, and we shouldn't throw it out. We should preserve it. Okay, thanks very much.